Today, I've got something truly special for you. A bonus episode made up of 5 all-time fan favorites. These are the kinds of stories that make you stop, shake your head, and think to yourself, no way, how could that possibly happen? For this episode, every single story has been carefully reworked and re-edited. So even if you've already heard one, or even all events of them before, this should still feel like a completely new experience. Let's get started. In 2007, a 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living in Bow, East London, with his wife and his 2 daughters. His life wasn't filled with excitement or big moments, but it was a good life. He lived in a quiet, safe neighborhood, and after years of working as a carpenter, Michael was now semi-retired, spending most of his time with friends and family. But that year, something began to weigh heavily on him. 10 years earlier, Michael had gone through a difficult divorce from his first wife. When it was finalized, his ex-wife stayed behind in the family home in Sudbury, England, along with the daughter they shared, Lisa, who was 21 years old at the time. Michael, meanwhile, moved roughly an hour and a half south, settling in Bow, East London. The divorce had been messy, and because of that, Michael didn't just lose contact with his former wife, he lost contact with Lisa as well. Now, a decade later, Michael and Lisa still hadn't spoken, and seemingly out of nowhere, Michael was hit with an overwhelming wave of grief. The realization that he had lost his relationship with his first child suddenly became impossible to ignore. After talking things through with his current wife and his 2 younger daughters, Michael made a decision. He had to find Lisa. He needed to see her again. The problem was, he had no idea where she lived. He didn't have her phone number. He didn't have an address. He didn't even know how to reach his ex-wife to ask. The only thing Michael still had was the street address of the old family home in Sudbury. So he decided that would be his starting point. In August of that year, Michael and his 2 younger daughters got into the car and drove from Bow, East London, up to Sudbury. When they arrived, Michael guided them down his old street, rows of brick houses lining both sides of the road, until he finally spotted his former home. He pulled over and parked directly in front. Michael stepped out of the car alone. He walked up to the front door, paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and knocked. When the door opened, it wasn't Lisa. It wasn't his ex-wife. It was a completely different family, strangers, and they didn't know Lisa or his ex-wife at all. They told him they were sorry, wished him luck in finding his daughter, but explained they had no information that could help. Michael was devastated. Still, he thanked them, turned around, and walked back to the car, where he told his daughters what had just happened. With no clear next step, the 3 of them began slowly driving through the streets of Sudbury. Part of them scanned the sidewalks and roads, half hoping, though none of them truly believed it, that they might somehow spot Lisa. At the same time, they talked through what they could possibly do next, because now they had nothing to go on. As they drove, one idea began to feel like their only real option. If Michael couldn't find Lisa directly, maybe he could let Sudbury find him. Maybe the answer was the local newspaper. So they drove to the offices of the Suffolk Free Press. Inside, they managed to speak with a reporter. Michael explained everything: the divorce, the lost years, and how he was desperately trying to reconnect with his daughter. The reporter listened, paused, and then said that this was actually a compelling story and that he'd be willing to do a small feature. The reporter and a photographer brought Michael and his 2 daughters outside. They took a photo and then explained that in the next edition, just a few days away, they would run the picture along with a short article explaining that Michael was searching for Lisa, including his contact information. Maybe she would see it. Maybe she would reach out. Maybe they'd finally be reunited. Michael thanked them both. Then he and his daughters got back into the car and drove home to Bow, East London. At the very same time, in 2007, while Michael was beginning his search, Lisa was having a realization of her own. She was now 31 years old. She was married. She had 3 children. And she had moved from Sudbury to a nearby town. Lately, she couldn't stop thinking about her father. She wanted to rebuild that relationship, not just for herself, but so her kids could know their grandfather. Lisa talked with her mother. She talked with friends. She tried to figure out how to find him. But just like Michael, she didn't have his phone number. She didn't have an address. No one she knew did. She searched for him online, but he wasn't on social media. Eventually, she felt completely stuck. Then one day in August, Lisa was at work. She walked into the break room and noticed a copy of the Suffolk Free Press lying on a table. She picked it up and casually flipped through the pages. And then she froze. There was a photo of herself. In the picture, she and her mother were walking down the streets of Sudbury. Lisa had been there just a couple of days earlier, talking with her mom about how to find her dad. Confused, she looked closer, then read the caption. She nearly fell out of her chair. The man and the two girls at the center of the photo weren't strangers. They were her father and her two stepsisters. Lisa hadn't recognized them at first. She had only noticed herself in the background of the image. By pure chance, after more than a decade apart, on the one single day, Lisa happened to be in Sudbury talking about how to find her father. She had been walking less than 100 feet behind him as he searched for her and arranged the newspaper ad meant to reunite them. That single photograph captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa read the article, found her father's contact information, and reached out. At first, Michael didn't believe it. He was convinced it had to be a scam. He couldn't accept that Lisa was calling to say, "I found myself in the picture of you in Sudbury." Eventually, Michael was convinced. He drove straight back to Sudbury, and for the very first time in his life, he got to meet his grandchildren. Today, he and Lisa are still in contact, still part of each other's lives. Now let's move to the next story. Back in 1964, during his final semester at college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to sign up for an acting class. He wasn't chasing a dream. He simply thought it would be an easy grade. He was also painfully shy, and he figured maybe this class could help him break out of that shell. What Harry didn't know was that this single class would quietly change the entire direction of his life. Not only did he meet the woman who would later become his wife, but he also discovered something completely unexpected. He loved acting. It wasn't something he had ever imagined enjoying, but once he felt it, he couldn't let it go. By the time college ended, Harry knew exactly what he wanted to pursue. After graduating later that year, he married his girlfriend, and the two of them flew out to Hollywood, California. Once there, Harry auditioned for the Columbia Pictures' new talent program, a system designed to help unknown actors break into an industry that is almost impossible to enter. He was accepted. Harry signed a contract that paid him next to nothing, but he didn't care. Almost immediately, they began sending him out for roles in television shows and movies. And almost immediately, nothing happened. No one was interested. At all. The only parts Harry managed to get were tiny, forgettable roles, often without a single line of dialogue. His career wasn't moving forward. It wasn't moving anywhere. Then, in 1966, 2 years after arriving in Hollywood, Harry finally caught what felt like his first real break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie. It was small, very small, a scene that lasted about 60 seconds. Harry walked onto the screen inside a hotel, called out for a guest, found him, handed him a piece of paper, and walked away. That was it. The scene was easy to forget, but it was real. It was in a real movie, and to Harry, it meant everything. After filming wrapped, Harry returned to the offices of the new talent program at Columbia Pictures. As soon as he walked in, one of the producers, the man overseeing the program, called him over and asked him to step into his office. They sat down. The producer didn't waste any time. He looked at Harry and said, "I'm just going to be honest with you. You're not going to make it in Hollywood. You're not going to be a movie star." He went on to explain that when Tony Curtis, a massive star of the 1950s and 1960s, appeared in one of his earliest films carrying groceries across a room, everyone instantly knew. Even with something that simple, you could see it. You could tell he was destined to be a star. Then the producer looked back at Harry. "And when I watched you walk through that hotel as a bellhop," he said, "I didn't see it. You don't have that thing. The X factor. You're not going to be a movie star." Harry sat there for a moment, absorbing the insult. Then he leaned forward, narrowed his eyes and said, "Well, if Tony Curtis was really that good of an actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery guy, not a movie star?" The remark landed exactly how you'd expect. The producer fired Harry on the spot. After being fired, Harry went on to sign a similar deal with a new talent program at Universal Studios. But the result was exactly the same. No meaningful roles, no momentum, nothing. Eventually, the feedback he received was brutally simple. He wasn't attractive enough, and he supposedly wasn't talented enough either. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s. He still wanted to be an actor. The dream hadn't died, but the reality was harsh. He was making almost no money from acting, and at some point he had to face the fact that wanting something didn't pay the bills. So Harry made a drastic pivot. He decided he was going to become a carpenter, full-time, even though he knew absolutely nothing about carpentry. Because of a growing interest, and partly out of desperation, Harry went to the library and checked out every book he could find on how to become a carpenter. Over the next few weeks, he studied obsessively, then started practicing on small projects around his own house. Eventually, either out of confidence or pure necessity, Harry began calling people he knew around Hollywood, asking if they needed any woodworking done. If they needed a carpenter, he was available. Surprisingly, people said yes. Before long, Harry was getting hired regularly, and somehow he earned a nickname, the Carpenter to the Stars, which was ironic because he actually wasn't very good at it. On more than one job, Harry could be seen working with one hand while holding an instruction book in the other, teaching himself how to do the job as he went. By 1976, Harry had been working as a carpenter full-time for about a year when he received a call from a close friend named Fred Roos, a casting director and film producer. Fred told him he had a very unusual opportunity. At this point, Harry wasn't interested in acting anymore. He had convinced himself that part of his life was over. He had a wife. He had 2 sons. And carpentry, whether he loved it or not, was paying the bills. So Harry told Fred, "I appreciate the offer, but if this has anything to do with acting, I'm not interested." Fred pushed back. He was one of the very few people in Hollywood who genuinely believed Harry was meant to be a star. "No," Fred said. "This is different. This isn't about auditioning and hoping for the best. This is about putting yourself in the right place and letting someone finally notice what you can actually do." That got Harry's attention. "All right," he said. "Tell me about it." Fred explained that there was an incredibly talented and eccentric film director preparing to cast his next movie. And his casting process was unconventional. Instead of bringing actors in one at a time, he grouped them together, letting them perform as a group. That way, he could see chemistry, dynamics, and individual talent all at once. All the groups were already set, except one. One male actor had dropped out at the last minute and wouldn't be there on audition day. When Fred heard about the missing spot, he immediately reached out to the director and said, "I've got your guy. There's someone named Harry. He's done some acting before," Fred told him. "He's genuinely talented. You have to give him a chance. At the very least, he can come in, read the lines, and help you run the audition. I know he's free that day, and I know he'd be happy to help." The director agreed. "All right," he said. "He can come down." But then he was very clear. Harry was not auditioning for any role. He wasn't being considered for the movie. He wasn't being thrown into the mix. The director took casting seriously, and Harry was not one of the people he had chosen. Harry would simply be there to read lines so the other actors could audition properly. That was it. When Fred finished explaining all of this, Harry was irritated. Fred had essentially volunteered him without really giving him a choice. Saying no now would make Fred look bad, and on top of that, the whole thing felt pointless. He was being asked to show up, read lines, and not even be considered. So how was this an opportunity at all? Fred tried one last time. He told Harry, "Look, worst case scenario, you meet some extremely powerful people. This director is a big deal. The actors there will be big deals. Maybe someone notices you, or maybe you land a few new carpentry clients. Either way, you walk away with something." After thinking it over, Harry finally gave in. "All right," he said. "Fine, I'll do it." On the day of the audition, Harry arrived and was handed a script. Almost immediately, he was reminded, over and over, not to audition, not to act, not to perform. He was told it didn't matter if he sounded flat or bored. He was only there to read the lines. Everyone else was auditioning. He was not. Harry understood. So he sat down and started reading. At first, he tried to follow instructions exactly, but as the day went on, something happened. His real emotions started leaking through. His frustration, his bitterness, his sarcasm. He began coming across as grumpy, sharp, and completely unimpressed with everyone around him. And that attitude, that careless, nonchalant, almost arrogant edge, was exactly what the director had been searching for in one of the characters. All day long, Harry kept reading the script again and again. He wasn't trying. He wasn't performing. He didn't care how he sounded. He was simply being himself. And without realizing it, he was absolutely nailing the role. No one told him they were watching him. No one hinted that he was being considered. They let him read all day long. At the end of the audition, Harry stood up, ready to toss the script in the trash and leave without saying goodbye to anyone. That's when the director stopped him. He walked up, looked at Harry and said, "Wait, I was wrong." He paused. "You're perfect for this movie. I want you to play Han Solo." Harrison didn't hesitate. He agreed to take the role of Han Solo, and that single decision launched him into the megastar the world knows today. A few years later, after Star Wars had turned him into a full-blown A-list celebrity, Harrison was having lunch at a restaurant inside a Hollywood studio. In the middle of his meal, a waiter approached his table carrying a silver tray. Resting on that tray was a single business card. Harrison picked it up. The waiter walked away. Written by hand on the card were just a few words. "I missed my bet." He flipped the card over. On the back was the name of the very same producer who years earlier had called him into an office and told him he would never make it in Hollywood, and then fired him on the spot. Apparently, that producer was eating in the same restaurant and had sent the card over as a quiet apology. Years later, Harrison would say in interviews that what made the moment so satisfying was what happened next. He realized the man was somewhere in the room, so he looked around, scanning the restaurant. But he couldn't spot him. He didn't even know what the guy looked like. To Harrison, he was nobody. So instead of wasting another second searching, Harrison tossed the card aside and calmly went back to eating his lunch. Now let's move to the next story. Michael Packard might be one of the luckiest, or unluckiest, people alive. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was flying over Costa Rica in a small plane when it suddenly crashed. The pilot, the co-pilot, and one passenger were killed instantly. Michael and 4 others survived the impact, but they were badly injured and stranded deep in a remote jungle. The survivors tried using the plane's damaged radio to send out a distress signal. They had no way of knowing if anyone was hearing them. All they could do was transmit the signal and wait, hoping rescue would come before it was too late. 48 hours later, rescuers hacked their way through the jungle and found them. Every survivor was saved. While Michael recovered in the hospital, a doctor told him something chilling. Based on his injuries, Michael would not have survived one more night out there. Plane crashes are incredibly rare. The odds are roughly 1 in several million, in some estimates, even 1 in tens of millions. To put that into perspective, Michael was far more likely to be struck by lightning than to ever experience a plane crash. But that crash wouldn't be the last time Michael would defy impossible odds. Over the following decades, Michael, a commercial diver by profession, survived not 1 but 2 serious encounters with great white sharks off the coast of California. Some of his friends weren't as fortunate. Michael didn't just survive rare events. He seemed to attract them. At one point, he became lost at sea. Not kind of lost, completely lost. Floating in open water for hours, with no land anywhere in sight. Somehow, a boat eventually spotted him and pulled him out, saving his life yet again. On another occasion, Michael discovered the body of a person who had been missing for years, hidden beneath the water roughly 60 feet down off the coast of Massachusetts. But out of everything Michael experienced, nothing comes close to what happened next. Experts say what he went through in 2021 carried odds of roughly 1 in a trillion. On the morning of June 11th, 2021, Michael, 57 years old at the time, climbed into a boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah. Once they had loaded all their gear, they headed out into open water just off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The plan was simple: lobster diving. One common way to catch lobsters is to dive down, grab them by hand, and bring them back to the surface. That was exactly what they intended to do that day. When they reached their spot offshore, Michael suited up in his scuba gear and slipped into the water. Josiah stayed on the boat. He wasn't diving that day. His job was to help Michael in and out of the water, haul lobsters onto the boat, and stay ready in case something went wrong. Just after 6 in the morning, Michael signaled that he was ready and descended beneath the surface. After a short while, he resurfaced with a fairly small catch. The two men shrugged it off, figuring it just wasn't a great day for lobsters. Still, Michael kept diving. For the next few hours, he went down again and again, pulling up whatever he could find. By around 8 in the morning, there were roughly 100 pounds of lobsters sitting in the boat. At that point, both men were feeling pretty good about the trip. Before calling it a day, Michael decided to make one final dive, just to grab a few more. Josiah watched as Michael, floating in the water, put his mouthpiece back in place and gave a final signal that he was good to go. Then, Michael disappeared beneath the surface. The ocean was calm, almost perfectly still. Josiah scanned the water, waiting. And then, without warning, the surface erupted. White water exploded upward, right where Michael had gone down. Josiah immediately leaned over the side of the boat, trying to look into the water for his friend. Michael was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Josiah noticed something enormous moving beneath them. On that final dive, Michael planned to sink down to the ocean floor at around 60 feet and search for lobsters. But when he reached roughly 45 feet, something slammed into him from behind with the force of a speeding truck. Instantly, everything went pitch black. The impact knocked the regulator out of his mouth. He had no air. He panicked, frantically reaching around, trying to find it, but couldn't. As he searched, his hands brushed against what felt like solid walls all around him. He was trapped inside a confined space. But as Michael touched the walls around him, he realized these weren't normal walls. They were soft, yet firm at the same time, and they were moving, pulsing, almost shivering around him. The space itself was surprisingly large, and it wasn't completely filled with water. It felt like he had somehow slipped into an air pocket. But this air pocket wasn't still. It was moving, fast. The water inside was sloshing violently, crashing against the surrounding walls. Michael could hear it smacking and churning all around him. As panic set in, and he desperately searched for his mouthpiece, Michael began to feel intense pressure squeezing his legs. He had no idea what was causing it. And in the total darkness, he couldn't see anything at all. Finally, his fingers found the hose connected to his regulator. He shoved it into his mouth and took a deep breath. Air rushed into his lungs. And that's when a terrifying thought hit him. Have I been swallowed by a shark? Instinctively, Michael began feeling around, searching for teeth. But there were none. No sharp edges, no jaws. Just those same shifting, moving walls. That's when the realization finally set in. He had been swallowed, but not by a shark. He had been swallowed by a whale. For nearly 45 seconds, Michael was trapped inside the closed mouth of a humpback whale. These animals are massive, growing up to 60 feet long and weighing as much as 70,000 pounds. But despite their size, they only eat small fish. When this whale realized Michael was not food, it reacted violently. It began swinging its head side to side, trying to shake him loose. That violent motion is what caused the explosion of white water Josiah saw at the surface. After several powerful thrashes, Michael was suddenly expelled from the whale's mouth. He found himself back in open water. Light filtered down from above, just enough for him to see. The ocean around him was chaotic, churning violently. As he kicked toward the surface, Michael looked straight down and saw the massive tail fin of the whale disappearing into the depths. Michael broke the surface and signaled frantically. Josiah sped over, pulled him out of the water, and hauled him back onto the boat. Michael was completely shaken. All he could manage to say was that he had been inside something and that it had tried to eat him. Josiah rushed Michael back to shore and called for help. Michael was taken to a hospital and examined, and unbelievably, he had no serious injuries. His legs were badly bruised, the result of the whale's mouth clamping down on him. That crushing pressure was what he had felt underwater. But beyond that, there was nothing else wrong. Later that same day, Michael was released. Experts believe the whale was a juvenile that had been seen in the area, likely measuring somewhere between 30 and 35 feet long. It had accidentally scooped Michael up while feeding. The whale wasn't attacking him. Humpback whales aren't aggressive toward humans. But despite that, Michael came terrifyingly close to death. He could have drowned, he could have suffocated, or he could have been killed by the sheer force of the impact. Somehow, he survived. But somehow, he didn't die. And what makes this even harder to believe is how casually Michael talked about it afterward. In every interview, he brushed it off like it was no big deal. He'd shrug and say things like, "Yeah, stuff like that happens. Whales come out of nowhere, they scoop you up. It happens." Reporters were stunned. They could barely believe he was real, and Michael would casually add that as soon as he fully recovered, he planned to get right back in the water and go lobster diving again. Now let's move to the next story. On the evening of January 6, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, just west of Denver, arrived at Denver International Airport. He was running late. His drive to the airport had been brutal. A massive snowstorm was slamming Denver and the surrounding areas, making the roads treacherous. Harold rushed through the terminal, checked in, passed through security, and reached his gate just as boarding began. Relieved, he joined the line of passengers heading down the ramp. A few minutes later, he stepped onto the plane and found his seat near the front on the right side. He sat down, buckled in, pulled an in-flight magazine from the seat pocket in front of him, and waited for takeoff. About 15 minutes later, the plane roared down the runway at full speed. Harold glanced out the window as they lifted into the air. Below him, the lights of Denver slowly faded as the plane climbed higher and higher. Just before entering a thick layer of clouds hanging over that part of Colorado, something caught Harold's attention. Off to the west of Jefferson County, the very area where Harold worked, was a long stretch of road cutting through the Rocky Mountains. It was known as Guanella Pass, a route that carried drivers over a mountain pass rising more than 11,000 feet. It was a stunning drive, and Harold knew it well. But in winter, the road wasn't maintained. If there was snow on the ground, the pass was completely impassable. Yet as Harold scanned the landscape below, he saw something that didn't make sense. There were headlights on Guanella Pass. Harold immediately thought, why would anyone be on that road during a storm like this? It shouldn't have been possible. Then he noticed something else. The driver was holding a flashlight out of the window, shining it straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off. It was a distress signal. That motorist was trapped. Harold knew the odds were nearly zero that another plane would fly over that exact spot, notice those lights, and recognize them as an emergency. If he didn't act, no one would. Harold knew instantly that if he didn't T-act, and act fast, whoever was down there was going to die. He jumped up from his seat, climbed over the passenger next to him, stepped into the aisle, and urgently waved down a flight attendant. When she rushed over, Harold explained who he was and why his instincts as a sheriff told him this was a real emergency. The attendant didn't hesitate. She took him seriously. She turned around, went straight into the cockpit, and explained everything to the pilots. The pilots immediately radioed authorities on the ground. Just minutes later, emergency crews were dispatched to Guanella Pass. About 15 minutes after that, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, arrived at the start of the Long Mountain Pass in a four-wheel drive SUV. As he pushed forward through the whipping snow and brutal wind, he spotted headlights glowing ahead in the darkness. Dave drove straight up to the vehicle. It was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and become buried in a deep snowbank. Dave parked, jumped out of his SUV, and rushed to the driver's side window. Inside sat a terrified man named Alan Phillips, a 30-year-old mechanic from the Denver area. It was the middle of the night. The temperature was around -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was relentless. Snow was pouring down, and Alan was wearing only a light jacket, jeans, and a small blanket wrapped around himself. If Harold hadn't seen that flashlight signal from the sky, Alan almost certainly would have frozen to death that night. When Alan looked up and saw Dave standing there, he completely broke down. He started crying, thanking God, overwhelmed with relief that he was going to survive. Dave asked him what had happened. Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, admitted that earlier that night he'd been drinking at a bar. When it was time to head home, he had made a terrible decision. He chose to drive through Guanella Pass, forgetting, or ignoring, the fact that the road wasn't maintained during winter. Then Dave noticed a deep bruise on Alan's cheek and asked how he got it, assuming it happened when the truck slid off the road. Alan gave an embarrassed smile and explained. After getting stuck, he had stepped out of the truck to relieve himself. When he turned to walk back, the snow was blowing so hard he couldn't see the vehicle. Panicking, he ran toward where he thought it was, and slammed face first into the truck door. That impact was what bruised his cheek. Dave just shook his head, smiled, and said, "Alan, you are one lucky man." Over the next several days, newspapers across Colorado and even some national outlets ran stories calling it a miracle at Guanella Pass. But as it turned out, that headline would not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, investigators discovered that Alan had lied about why he was on Guanella Pass that night. The truth was far darker. Earlier that same night, before Alan ever got stranded, he had murdered 2 hitchhikers near Breen Ridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from Guanella Pass. For decades, both killings remained unsolved. But in late 2020, DNA evidence finally linked Alan to both crimes. Several hours before his rescue, Alan picked up a 22-year-old hitchhiker named Annette Schnee. After she got into his truck, investigators believe he pulled a gun on her and restrained her wrists with zip-tie handcuffs. What happened next is unclear, but at some point that night, Annette was forced out of the vehicle, led into the woods, shot in the back, and left face down in a stream. A few hours later, Alan picked up another hitchhiker, 29-year-old Barbara Overberholzer. It's believed he followed the same pattern, threatening her at gunpoint and restraining her. But Barbara fought back. She managed to break free and is believed to have struck Alan in the face, the blow that caused the deep bruise on his cheek. Barbara ran. Alan chased her down, shot her in the chest, killing her, and then dumped her body over the edge of a cliff into the snowbank below. The only reason Alan ended up trapped on Guanella Pass that night was because he was fleeing the area where he had committed these murders, and he likely had no idea how dangerous that road truly was in winter. Shortly after turning onto the pass, his truck slid off the road and became stuck. In February of 2021, Alan, now 70 years old and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for both murders. As of now, he is awaiting trial. His motives remain unclear. He has never explained why he did it, and investigators do not know whether there may be additional victims. Now, let's move to the next story. Just after midnight on June 22, 1991, a man named Charles Holden was driving home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his home in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite, Charles got back into his truck and started the engine. As he was about to pull out of the parking lot, he noticed a man running toward him, waving his arms, trying to flag him down. Charles stopped, put the truck in park, and rolled down his window to see what the man wanted. The stranger told him his sister was in labor and that he needed a ride to the hospital, about 20 minutes away. Charles hesitated. It was late. He didn't know this man, and something about the situation felt wrong. So he told him no. He apologized, said it was too late, and explained it was too far out of his way. The stranger looked disappointed, turned around, and started walking away. Watching him leave, Charles felt a pang of guilt, and that's when he called out, "Hey, come back here. I'll take you part of the way," Charles said. The stranger's mood instantly changed. He smiled, climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove off together. Charles headed in the direction the man had asked for, but after about 3 miles, he pulled over to the side of the road. "This is as far as I'm going," Charles said. His house was only about a block away, and he didn't want to be far from home so late at night. The moment the stranger realized he was being dropped off, everything shifted. His expression hardened. He reached into his pocket, fumbling like he was grabbing a weapon, and suddenly began shouting, "Give me your keys! Give me your wallet, or I'll kill you!" Charles had already been uneasy the entire drive. That sick feeling in his gut instantly turned into panic. He didn't hesitate. He shut off the engine, yanked the keys out of the ignition, jumped out of the truck, and started running. In the distance, Charles spotted a convenience store. If he could just make it there, he could get help. But as he ran, he glanced over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. The stranger had leapt out of the truck too. He was chasing Charles, sprinting toward him with a screwdriver clenched in his hand. The man was fast, too fast, and he was closing the distance quickly. It became obvious that Charles wasn't going to reach the store in time, so Charles stopped. He turned around, raised his hands, and said, Okay, I'll take you wherever you want to go. You can have my wallet, my keys, anything you want." The stranger ran up to him and stopped. He smiled, clearly pleased. He poked Charles with the screwdriver and gestured toward the truck. Charles walked back slowly, the stranger right behind him, jabbing him in the back with the screwdriver every few steps. When they reached the truck, the stranger told Charles to get inside and wait. The moment Charles sat down, he did the exact opposite. He fired up the engine and slammed on the gas, speeding off before the stranger could even get the passenger door open. Charles tore down the road. In his rearview mirror, he could see the man chasing after him, screwdriver raised above his head. But after a few seconds, the stranger stopped. He turned around and walked away. Charles was overwhelmed with relief. He had escaped. He considered calling the police, but ultimately decided against it. He blamed himself for letting a stranger into his truck in the first place. What worried him more was where he had left the man. It wasn't far from his house. Charles was afraid that if he drove straight home, the stranger might recognize his truck and follow him. So instead, Charles stayed out of town, driving around aimlessly for a while, waiting, hoping that the man would be gone. After roughly an hour, Charles finally headed back toward Harrington. As he turned onto his street, his heart nearly stopped. The man who had just tried to kill him was walking down the road, right in front of his house. Luckily, the stranger didn't notice Charles pulling onto his street. The moment Charles realized that, he slammed the truck into reverse and got out of there as fast as he could. That was when the fear really set in. Charles didn't know if this man recognized him. He didn't know if he was being watched. And the thought that this stranger might be waiting somewhere near his home was too much to ignore. So Charles finally decided he had to call the police. He dialed 911 and explained everything. The encounter earlier, the chase, and the fact that the man was now lurking near his property. The dispatcher told him an officer was on the way. A few minutes later, an officer met Charles at the payphone where he was waiting. The officer told him they would escort him back home, and if the stranger was still in the area, they would arrest him. They drove back to Charles's house together. By the time they arrived, the stranger was gone. Charles went inside. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing appeared disturbed. Relieved, Charles thanked the officer. But before the officer left, Charles asked one more thing. He asked if the officer would check on his mother's house. She lived directly behind him, just beyond a line of bushes. Her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old, lived alone, and Charles just wanted to be sure she was okay. The officer agreed. He walked through Charles's backyard, pushed through the bushes, and entered Dorothy's yard. Almost immediately he saw something was wrong. The back window in the door had been smashed, and the door itself was slightly open. The officer drew his weapon and carefully entered the house. He called out Dorothy's name. No answer. The house was dark, completely silent. After clearing the first floor and finding nothing, the officer went upstairs. At the top of the stairs, he saw blood. He followed the trail into one of the bedrooms. Dorothy was lying on the bed. She had been stabbed to death. Investigators later learned that after Charles escaped and drove away, the stranger, a man named Gilbert Cannon, had been looking for somewhere to sleep. The house he chose at random just happened to be Dorothy's. After breaking in through the back door, Gilbert encountered Dorothy as she came downstairs to confront him. Fearing she could identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver and killed her. Gilbert later told police that his encounter with Charles had been completely random. He had simply seen Charles at the fast food restaurant, watched him get into his truck and thought, "If I can get into that vehicle, I can rob him." After the failed robbery, when he broke into a nearby house and encountered a woman coming down the stairs, he had no idea she was Charles's mother. The entire night was a chain of horrific coincidences. Gilbert Cannon would later plead guilty to the murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And stories like these leave one question hanging in the air. How thin is the line between chance and tragedy? If this story stayed with you, let it be known. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that pull you in, keep you thinking, and remind you how unpredictable life really is, make sure you resubscribed and don't miss what comes next.